In April 2024, inside a motel room on Figueroa Street, a 14-year-old girl was sold to strangers for 3 days without a break. Federal agents would eventually charge 18 people over what happened along that street and name 51 victims. But the person the Justice Department placed at the top of the case, the one they say the others answered to, was a 25-year-old woman who went by Lady Duck, and the authorities immediately arrested her in August 2025. However, that did not stop the operation as it kept running for another 10 months. Federal agents moved across Los Angeles County on the morning of August 13, 2025, hitting addresses in South Los Angeles, Long Beach, Mid-City, and Riverside, and by noon they had 5 people in custody. The 6th was already behind a locked door. Amaya Armstead came into federal hands by transfer from a California state cell, walked from one system straight into another, and stood for arraignment in a downtown federal courtroom that same afternoon. At 25 years old, Amaya Armstead, known on Figueroa as Lady Duck, sat at the top of an 11-person federal indictment as the case's lead defendant, identified by the Department of Justice as the de facto leader of the 112 set of the Hoover criminal gang. That phrase carries the weight of the entire case, and it repays a moment of attention. De facto leadership means no title is being claimed. There is no roster to point at, no rank, no ceremony marking her elevation. The claim is that whatever anyone called her, she functioned as the person in control. Decisions ran through her, the men around her acted on her direction, and the shape of the operation reflected her authority. It is a characterization written by lawyers building a racketeering case, which makes it the first thing a defense team will move to dismantle. And here the story hits a wall. Beyond her age, her alias, her neighborhood, and the accusations themselves, the public record establishes almost nothing about Amaya Armstead. No verified account of where she grew up. No explanation of when or how she came into contact with the Hoovers. No interview, no statement of any kind. Her attorney declined to comment when the indictment was unsealed, and she has said nothing publicly in the 11 months since. The one door standing slightly open is the transfer itself, since California had her before the federal government did, which means a state case sits somewhere behind a records wall that nobody has opened. Understanding what a leadership claim actually demands in a courtroom explains why that blank space matters so much. To prove one person directed a criminal enterprise, prosecutors generally need some combination of 4 things: cooperating witnesses who will testify about who issued orders, intercepted communications capturing that direction as it happened, financial patterns showing money moving consistently upward toward a single person, and surveillance placing her in a supervisory posture rather than a participating one. The years IRS criminal investigation spent inside this case point directly at the third. Which of those the government actually holds against Armstead, and in what quantity, has never been disclosed. Indictments are built to charge rather than to argue, so the filings assert the conclusion and keep the foundation sealed. The strength of the central claim in this entire prosecution remains genuinely unknown outside the 2 sets of lawyers preparing for March 2027. What can be said is that her name appears first on a caption listing 11 people. In multi-defendant federal cases, that ordering reflects the government's theory of relative culpability, and prosecutors decided, before a single piece of evidence faced examination, that of everyone charged, she carried the most. The organization Amaya Armstead is accused of leading a piece of is older than the Crips. It began on the west side of South Central Los Angeles in the 1960s as the Hoover Groovers, a neighborhood crew named for the street it claimed, operating in an era when Los Angeles gangs were loose, local, and organized around a few blocks rather than a citywide structure. By the mid-1970s, the Groovers had aligned with the West Side Crips, dropped the old name, and become the Hoover Crips. And when the Crips fractured in 1979 over the war between the Rollin' 60s and the 8 Trays, the Hoovers went with the Gangster Crips faction. Then in August 1979, Crips co-founder Raymond Washington was killed in a drive-by, and the East Side Crips blamed the Hoovers. The Hoovers denied it. Responsibility was never settled, and it stopped mattering. The accusation alone produced a feud that ran for years and permanently lengthened the list of people willing to shoot at them. The 1980s brought crack, and with it the transformation of a neighborhood gang into a distribution network. The Hoovers moved heavily into street-level narcotics across South Central, and Freeway Ricky Ross, the most successful crack dealer in the country during that period, operated in and around Hoover membership. By the middle of the decade, law enforcement rated them among the most active street gangs in South Los Angeles. The decision that shaped everything after came in the early 1990s, when several Hoover sets cut the word Crips out of their name entirely and started calling themselves the Hoover Criminals. They took on two slogans to go with it: ABK, Anybody Killer, and EBK, Everybody Killer. And the graffiti in their territory began carrying threats aimed at Bloods, Crips, and Rolling Zeros simultaneously. Understand what that actually meant in practice, because it is the single most important fact about how this organization operates. Declaring yourself Everybody Killer is a decision to have no allies. It ends the alliance structure that every other Los Angeles gang depends on for protection, for territory, for supply, for safe passage. Over the following 2 decades, the Hoovers fought Bloods, fought Crips, fought Hispanic gangs, and severed nearly every historical relationship they had. Their last significant outside alliance, with the Main Street Mafia Crips, collapsed in 2009 after a 13-year-old Hoover member named Daquan Allen was shot dead near a swap meet on Broadway, and 2 Main Street affiliated men were killed 9 days later. An organization with no allies has to be economically self-contained. It cannot borrow territory, share supply lines, or rely on anyone else's protection, which means every dollar it needs has to be generated inside its own boundaries, from whatever assets those boundaries happen to contain. The Hoover's boundaries contain the Figueroa corridor. Armstead is accused of running one set inside that structure, and the 1 and 12 has its own particular history. Through the 2000s, a run of violent confrontations allowed the Denver Lane Bloods to push into territory the 112 Hoover Criminals had previously held. Losing ground carries a direct financial consequence for a street organization, since territory is the revenue base. Fewer blocks means fewer corners, less traffic, less money moving through fewer hands. A set under that kind of pressure has to find income that does not depend on holding as much pavement as it used to. A stretch of Figueroa Street where buyers arrive on their own every night without needing to be recruited or supplied is exactly that kind of income. The 112 name also appears well outside Los Angeles. Hoover sets spread along drug distribution routes beginning in the 1980s, reaching Seattle, Houston, Oklahoma City, and Portland. And Portland in particular grew 112, 107, and 74 Hoover sets active enough to import the original Los Angeles rivalries wholesale, which is worth holding on to, given that the trafficking case against Armstead somehow reached 3 law enforcement agencies in Nebraska. One more thing about the Hoovers matters here, and it has nothing to do with territory. Membership runs through families. Members describe brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and mothers claiming the same set across 3 and 4 generations, with children raised inside it long before they are old enough to choose it. Women are part of that inheritance in a way outsiders consistently miss, present in the family structure of the organization for decades, even where they were absent from its leadership. That does not establish anything about Amaya Armstead, whose connection to the Hoovers has never been publicly explained. It does mean the government's theory of a woman holding authority inside a Hoover set is not the impossibility it is sometimes described as online. What makes the allegation unusual comes down to simple arithmetic. Street gang leadership in Los Angeles skews overwhelmingly male, and the trafficking economy running through the Figueroa corridor has historically been organized by men who treat women as inventory. The government's theory installs a woman in the controlling seat inside that structure, functioning as the person the enterprise answered to rather than someone attached to a man who held power. Precision matters here because the claims circulating online have outrun the filings considerably. Prosecutors have never called her the first woman to lead a Hoover set, or the most powerful woman in the organization's history, or any kind of singular figure in Los Angeles gang history. The Justice Department's assertion is narrower and far more specific. Inside the 112 set, across a defined window of time, Amaya Armstead was functionally in charge. The narrow version is the one that has to survive a jury, and it is the more interesting claim anyway. A second question sits underneath it that the filings never resolve. The operation described in the indictment draws men from Long Beach, Mid-City, and Riverside, and later from Anaheim, Palmdale, and Compton, a geographic spread reaching well past any single set's territory. Whether the government contends she directed all of that, or the 112 set alone, or only the victims connected to her personally, appears nowhere in anything released publicly. That distinction will do enormous work at trial. Running a set is one allegation. Running a multi-city trafficking network is a substantially larger one, and the sentences attached to each look very different. What the record does establish is that whatever authority she held it inside a structure where every other charged participant was a man. Understanding what she is accused of running requires seeing the Figueroa corridor less as a neighborhood than as an economy. The relevant stretch runs roughly 3.5 miles along Figueroa Street, placed by the 2025 indictment between approximately Slauson Avenue and Century Boulevard. On the street, it goes by the Blade, and in shorthand simply Fig, a strip of motels, fast food counters, auto shops, and residential blocks where thousands of people live ordinary lives, and which has spent decades as the most visible open-air sex trade corridor in Los Angeles. The word for a place like this is a track, somewhere commercial sex work happens on foot, in the open, on a repeating circuit. Buyers drive it, sellers walk it, and whoever controls it collects. From February 2021 onward, the Hoovers largely controlled that trade. Controlled it as an organized enterprise with rules, defined roles, shared logistics, and a financial structure moving money between participants, rather than merely operating within it. That framing determined the entire shape of the prosecution. Rather than charging 11 people with 11 crimes that happened to occur in the same place, the government charged them as a single racketeering enterprise, and every defendant in the original indictment faces one count of conspiracy to violate the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. RICO, the statute built to prosecute organizations rather than individuals. Under a RICO theory, the corridor stops functioning as scenery and becomes the enterprise itself, with Armstead placed at the top of it. The indictment returned in August 2025 ran 31 counts against 11 people, and the Justice Department listed them by name, age, and moniker. Amaya Armstead, 25, Lady Duck of South Los Angeles. Kanyandra Young, 22, Yunki Polk. Nazis Harris, 19, N4. Avery Amoako, 27, Hands of Long Beach. Jared Evans, 29, Jay Money, out of Mid-City. Matthew Brooks, 22, Vermont Star of Riverside. Derail Robinson, 22, Popcorn. Jalen Phillips, 22, Chop'em. Brian Israel, 31, Forelock. T. John Gray, 25, Tiny 3, and Tommy Crockham, 30, Tommy Guns. The ages tell their own story: 19, 22, 22, 22, 22, 25, 25, 27, 29, 30, 31. A median sitting in the low 20s for the people charged with running the most notorious sex trade corridor in the city. The youngest at 19 would have been roughly 14 when the enterprise began in February 2021, the same age as the youngest victim named against Armstead. Alongside the racketeering count, the 11 face sex trafficking of minors, sex trafficking through force, fraud, or coercion, transportation of a minor for sex trafficking, sexual exploitation of a child, drug trafficking conspiracy, money laundering, and conspiracy to straw purchase firearms. That final charge deserves a note because straw purchasing means rooting gun buys through someone with a clean record. Its presence in a trafficking indictment signals a group arming itself through a deliberate workaround, using people who could pass a background check as proxies for people who could not. 5 defendants went down that August morning: Amoko, Evans, Brooks, Phillips, and Crockham, while Armstead came over from state custody and 3 others sat in California state facilities already. Nazis Harris was in Nebraska, and Brian Israel was nowhere to be found, with law enforcement still searching for him as the announcement went out. Nebraska deserves a pause because it surfaces twice. Beyond Harris sitting in custody there, the Nebraska State Patrol, the Keith County Attorney's Office, and the Nebraska Department of Justice all turn up among the agencies that supported the investigation. Keith County sits along Interstate 80 in the western half of the state, roughly 1,500 miles from Figueroa Street. Whatever pulled 3 Nebraska agencies and a 19-year-old defendant into a South Los Angeles trafficking case has never been explained in any public filing, and it remains one of several threads in this prosecution that visibly runs past the corridor and out of sight. The filings say remarkably little about who these 11 people actually were. They say a great deal about what the operation did. Everything that follows in this section comes from the government's case. The conduct described in 2 federal indictments, none of it yet tested in front of a jury. Read it as the charge rather than the verdict. What those documents describe reads less like a street hustle than a business with departments. It starts with recruitment. The defendants work together to pull in victims through social media and in person, concentrating on vulnerable minor girls and young women, and the filing names the criteria without euphemism. Those carrying financial or emotional struggles, those who had run from home, and those inside the foster care system. Read that as a targeting profile, and it describes young people who will not be reported missing within the hour, who have no stable adult tracking their movements, who have already learned that institutions fail to protect them, and who can vanish into a motel room without anyone calling police that night. The presence of the Los Angeles Department of Children and Family Services and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children among the agencies supporting the investigation indicates exactly where investigators had to go to work out who had been taken. Social media turns that targeting into something efficient. A recruiter working a corner can only approach whoever stands in front of him, while a recruiter working a phone can filter. Reading who posts about leaving home, who posts about having no money, who posts at 3 in the morning, whose feed has quietly stopped mentioning family. The vulnerability arrives self-reported, publicly at scale, from children with no idea they are being sorted. The approach itself came in 3 forms: false promises of a luxurious lifestyle, intimidation, and actual or threatened violence. And the filings describe all 3 operating inside the same enterprise, sometimes running against the same girl in sequence, with the promise arriving first and the violence surfacing only once she was already inside. Then came the drugs, and the language in the second indictment is unusually direct about why. Pimps supplied victims with narcotics ranging from oxycodone to amphetamines for the stated purpose of creating addictions they could then exploit. A claim about design rather than circumstance. The dependency was manufactured deliberately by the same people who would go on to control the supply. Once that dependency exists, physical restraint becomes unnecessary because a girl who needs a dose does not need a locked door. Withdrawal does the work instead, and whoever holds the pills sets every term that follows: how many hours she works, who she works for, and what she tells a police officer if one ever asks her anything. The specific combination named in the filing carries its own logic, since oxycodone sedates while amphetamines stimulate. Together they describe a chemistry running in both directions, something to keep a person functional across consecutive days of work, and something to blunt what those days involved. The economic structure was total. Victims handed over every dollar earned from commercial sex dates. Not a percentage, not a split, but all of it. In return, the pimp was expected to supply protection, clothing, housing, food and beauty services, and that last item carries more weight than it appears to. The women were required to keep their hair and nails done at all times because grooming functioned as a status symbol, signaling the standing of the man who controlled her. Follow that arrangement to its conclusion, and a woman's appearance was being maintained as advertising for someone else's rank. Upkeep paid for out of money she had earned and surrendered, applied to a body she no longer held authority over. Breaking the rules triggered a graduated system of consequences that ran through assaults, berating, public humiliation, and the withholding of affection, drugs or food, with the August 2025 indictment adding punitive extended hours on the street and expulsion from the operation entirely. The construction of that list is worth studying because it moves from physical violence through emotional withdrawal into chemical deprivation and finally starvation, covering every category of human need: safety, belonging, chemistry, food, and converting each one into a lever. A girl managed this way holds no untouched part of her life to retreat into, and the fact that expulsion sits at the end as the ultimate threat tells you the system had successfully made itself her only available world. No ledger for the Hoover operation appears in any public filing, though the numbers surfacing in adjacent federal cases on the same corridor give a sense of the scale. In a prosecution announced on Figueroa in September 2024, a pimp working the corridor expected $1,000 a night from a 15-year-old girl. Whether she ever reached it hardly matters because the figure functioned as a quota, the number she had to hit before she was permitted to stop. Working backwards from a number like that reveals the shape of a night, a continuous cycle of transactions, hours spent on foot in the open, and a motel room turning over repeatedly until morning. No version of that quota leaves room for rest, for refusal, or for choosing anyone. Someone else's arithmetic decides when the night ends, and falling short triggers everything described above. Now set that inside the Hoover structure, where every dollar went upward. Motel rooms were pooled across multiple pimps. Victims were driven to and from the street by whoever happened to be free, and the money moved between the men afterward through payment apps. The person generating all of that revenue never held any of it, while the people who did were settling accounts with each other. There is a category of participant running through this entire story who has gone almost entirely unnamed, and the arithmetic makes them impossible to ignore. Every dollar in that quota arrived in the hand of a man who drove to Figueroa Street, selected a girl from a sidewalk, paid for a motel room, and went inside. $1,000 a night, across 5 years, across a 3.5-mile corridor, across 51 identified victims, represents an enormous and uninterrupted stream of paying customers. Thousands of individual transactions carried out by thousands of individual men, many of whom would have understood exactly how young the girl in front of them was. The corridor's reputation was the business model. Its notoriety functioned as advertising, drawing buyers from across the county to a strip where everyone knew what was available. And that reputation held for decades precisely because the demand never faltered. The indictments in this case name 18 defendants. Not one of them is a buyer. That is not an oversight, since federal racketeering statutes are built to dismantle organizations rather than to prosecute individual customers. And the resources required to identify a man who paid cash for 20 minutes in a motel room 5 years ago are close to prohibitive. It does mean, however, that the entire demand side of this economy walked away untouched, and demand is the part that rebuilds a corridor after every takedown. Which brings us to the detail that gives this story its title and its permanence. Victims were branded with tattoos carrying a defendant's moniker, the street name of the man who controlled her, driven permanently into her skin. The function's inventory management. In an economy where several pimps work the same 3.5 miles, share motel space, and move each other's victims around, ownership has to be legible at a glance, and a tattoo settles the question instantly. Anyone on the corridor can read it, and so can anyone in a holding cell, an emergency room, or a rival's car. The superseding indictment sharpens this considerably by listing branding among the disciplinary measures themselves, grouped alongside assaults, humiliation, and the withholding of food. The mark worked as a label applied at the beginning and as a punishment applied whenever someone stepped out of line. There is a particular cruelty buried in that placement, because a tattoo cannot be revoked when the relationship ends, when the enterprise collapses, or when the girl finally gets out. Every other consequence on that list expires. A woman who survived this, testified about it, and rebuilt an entire life afterward would still be carrying the name of the man who sold her, decades later, on her own body. Coordination is what separates this from a loose collection of individual pimps, and the indictment describes a great deal of it. The defendants actively facilitated each other's operations, managing and monitoring one another's victims, disciplining one another's victims, driving them to and from the stretch of street where they solicited, pooling money to rent several motel rooms at once, and sourcing third parties to build online advertising profiles. That amounts to a shared operating system covering personnel, transport, enforcement, real estate, and marketing, run cooperatively across a group of men and, according to the government, one woman at the top. The detail about outsourced advertising is quietly significant because it places a separate layer of people outside the gang. Individuals writing listings, uploading photographs, and maintaining accounts who knew precisely what they were advertising. The indictment never names them. The money moved the way money moves now, with defendants sending funds to each other through Cash App and Apple Pay, consumer payment apps running on phones, generating a permanent, time-stamped, subpoenable record of who paid whom and when. That is precisely why IRS criminal investigation attached itself to this case rather than appearing as a formality. Financial investigators can reconstruct the architecture of an enterprise from transaction data alone. Who received from whom, in what pattern, at what intervals, in what amounts, and juries often find that reconstruction more convincing than any single witness, because a payment ledger cannot be frightened into silence, never changes its story, and always shows up to testify. Then there is the infrastructure the whole thing depended on. An open-air track requires rooms, since buyers arrive on the street while the transaction happens indoors, and that demands motel space continuously and at volume, in a pattern impossible to miss from behind a front desk. This is the structural vulnerability in any street-level trafficking operation, and it explains why the corridor sits exactly where it does. A gang can hold a sidewalk through presence and violence, but it cannot manufacture rooms, and every transaction has to pass through a building somebody owns, somebody staffs, and a city licenses. The operation only lasts as long as it's access to that space, which leaves any motel on the corridor facing a decision because the volume is visible. The same faces, the same short stays, the same rooms turning over through the night, cash arriving at the desk. A property either refuses that business and watches it move down the street, or takes it and becomes part of the machine. The Figueroa corridor supplied the rooms. Los Angeles authorities have described the Sun Motel, sitting in the corridor, as a gang hotspot, though the property appearing repeatedly through the federal filings is the Stadium Inn. In April 2024, Armstead and Jared Evans used rooms at the Stadium Inn to traffic victims, and one of them was 14 years old, trafficked there for at least 3 consecutive days. 3 days inside a motel on a commercial street in Los Angeles, in a room that was rented, serviced, and rented again while it was happening. That single allegation is the specific conduct attached to Armstead's name, and the reason the Justice Department's announcement identifies her not merely as lead defendant, but as the woman accused of sex trafficking a 14-year-old girl. Should prosecutors prove nothing else about her, that is the allegation defining the case and driving the sentence. A second dated incident surfaces in the same filing. In April 2022, T. John Gray and 2 others drove out to an area of San Bernardino known for prostitution activity and tried to force 2 women into their car, grabbing at them until both broke free and ran. The incident matters for what it reveals about method, describing recruitment by attempted abduction, carried out in the open, roughly 60 miles outside the corridor. The operation was not waiting for vulnerable girls to arrive on Figueroa Street. It was driving to other counties to collect them. The last piece of the system is the one that makes it recognizably modern. Members of the enterprise produce rap music and videos glorifying the gang, sex trafficking, drug sales, and firearms possession, while separately posting videos and photographs of their assaults on other people to social media, with the stated purpose of intimidating victims into understanding what disobedience produced. Follow the mechanics of that and something becomes apparent. Using a video of a beating as a control mechanism requires the people being controlled to see it, which means the post has to stay public enough to reach them, permanent enough to be re-watched, and clear enough to register as a message. The same material functioning as a threat therefore sat on a server, time-stamped, with an account attached. Every element that made the operation efficient, the payment apps, the advertising profiles, the social posts, the motel records, also made it documentable. The enterprise was built on infrastructure that keeps receipts. By the summer of 2025, federal investigators had been collecting those receipts for 4.5 years. What they did with them that August should have ended the trade on Figueroa Street. Before any of the arrests, there was a warning. On September 4th, 2024, federal, county, and city officials stood together in Los Angeles to announce the Figueroa Corridor Human Trafficking Initiative, a coordinated effort aimed squarely at trafficking and the sexual exploitation of minors along that stretch of street. The lineup at that podium represented essentially every level of government with jurisdiction over the corridor. The United States Attorney, the Mayor of Los Angeles, the City Attorney, the County District Attorney, the LAPD's Chief, the FBI's Assistant Director in charge for Los Angeles, Homeland Security Investigations, and the council member whose district contains the corridor. United States Attorney Martin Estrada called the area Ground Zero for human trafficking, described victims being abused and exploited there daily, and laid out a strategy of moving more of these cases into federal court, particularly those involving children. Mayor Karen Bass pointed out that community leaders and former foster youth had been fighting this on the corridor for decades, and that many of the children caught up in it had spent time in the child welfare system. 3 prosecutions launched the initiative that day. One charged a 21-year-old with trafficking a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, both reported missing out of California, both of whom told police they normally worked FIG. Another charged a couple with assaulting a 13-year-old girl and producing images of it, after allegedly discussing helping her run away and finding her work on the same corridor. The third involved a man already serving life in federal prison for pimping teenage girls, one of them 15, from whom he expected $1,000 a night. That third case matters twice over. It proves federal prosecutors had already won a life sentence on this corridor before any Hoover defendant was charged, and one of the prosecutors who tried it, Chelsea Norrell, would go on to prosecute the Hoover case as well. So the corridor had been publicly identified, the resources assembled, and the message delivered at a press conference with the mayor standing at it. The trafficking enterprise on Figueroa Street continued operating for another 21 months. 11 months after that announcement, a federal grand jury returned the 31-count indictment. Homeland Security investigations, IRS criminal investigation, the LAPD, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Central District of California led the investigation, supported by the California Highway Patrol, the Los Angeles Department of Children and Family Services, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the anti-trafficking organization Saving Innocents, and 3 Nebraska agencies. Bill Asaley, then the acting United States Attorney in Los Angeles, framed the announcement bluntly, arguing that conduct of this kind carried no meaningful consequence under California state law, and that federal prosecution was therefore the only route to lengthy sentences. He described the operation as the first step toward returning the Figueroa corridor to residents who had lived alongside it for decades. That argument runs into genuine disagreement. Advocates working with trafficking survivors have long held that the difficulty on corridors like Figueroa has less to do with sentence length than with the conditions continuously supplying vulnerable young people to it. Foster care instability, youth homelessness, and the near total absence of exit options for a girl already on the street. Both propositions can hold simultaneously, since federal charges reach conduct state prosecution never touched while doing nothing whatsoever about the pipeline feeding it. LAPD Chief Jim McDonnell placed his emphasis elsewhere, describing victims who were minors, runaways, and foster youth, preyed upon by people seeking profit from their pain. The decision to charge this as racketeering sits at the strategic center of the case, and it deserves explanation. Prosecuting street-level trafficking one defendant at a time fails constantly. Each case rests on a single victim who has to be located, protected, kept stable, and made willing to testify against a man who knows where she sleeps and exactly what frightens her. Witnesses stop answering their phones. Witnesses recant. Witnesses disappear entirely. RICO rewrites that arithmetic by charging the enterprise itself and tying each defendant to the whole through their participation in it. A defendant can be convicted on the pattern of activity the organization engaged in, rather than solely on testimony from the specific girl he is accused of exploiting. And evidence about the enterprise becomes admissible against everyone inside it. The collapse of any single witness stops being fatal to the case. The trade-off is difficulty, since RICO obliges the government to prove the enterprise existed as an organized, ongoing structure with a pattern of racketeering activity. That these 11 people amounted to something more than 11 criminals operating near each other. Defense attorneys attack precisely that seam, and the higher a defendant sits within the alleged structure, the more the government must prove about control, direction, and knowledge, which returns us to that phrase, de facto leader, operating now as a burden the government has volunteered to carry. Prosecutors will have to satisfy 12 jurors that a woman in her mid-20s genuinely directed a Hoover set. Not that she was present, not that she participated, not that she stood close to people who did, but that she ran it. All 11 defendants pleaded not guilty, and their trial is scheduled for March 18th, 2027. More than 18 months after the arrests, and nearly 6 years after the conduct in the indictment allegedly began. Here's where the story stops being a takedown. The August 2025 arrest went out publicly as the first major operation against sex trafficking on the Figueroa corridor, with 6 people in custody, a lead defendant sitting in federal detention, and a stated intention to hand the corridor back to its residents. The corridor did not come back. On June 25th, 2026, a federal grand jury returned a 65-count superseding indictment, unsealed the following week, and the most important detail buried inside that document is a date range. The original indictment ran the enterprise from February 2021 to August 2025, ending effectively on the morning of the arrests. The superseding indictment extends that window from February 2021 to June 2026, 10 more months. Running after the lead defendant went into federal custody, after 5 arrests, after a national press announcement, and after the U.S. Attorney's Office had already stood up and declared the corridor reclaimed. Agents went back in on July 1st, 2026, arresting 9 people that day and 10 in total, while adding 7 new defendants to the case. 6 of them are alleged Hoover criminal gang members: Cameron Lockett, 23, Janky of Anaheim; Khalid Mouton, 26, Pooh of South Los Angeles; Nakali Miller, 30, FY3; Jorge Melendez, 23, Crim Style; Mauricio Ulloa Franco Jr., 23, Easy Face of Palmdale; and LaGraine Lennox, 30, King Blue of Compton. Across both indictments, 18 defendants now face 65 counts under the name investigators gave the case, Operation Broken Blade, and the superseding indictment lists 51 victims, 51, drawn from one filing, one corridor, one gang, across a single 5-year period, counting only the people federal investigators managed to identify and attach to specific allegations. It functions as a floor rather than an estimate of how many passed through the blade in those years. The most consequential name added in June 2026 belongs to no gang at all. Mukesh Kumar Rambhai Ahir, 45, manager of the Stadium Inn and Spas Motel in South Los Angeles, was arrested and charged with financially benefiting from the Hoover Gang's sex trafficking operation, and the allegations against him reframe everything that came before. Ahir told investigators that as much as 90% of the rooms he rented were being used for trafficking, and that he rented to anyone able to pay. Authorities say he kept half the proceeds from every transaction, with the money eventually reaching the bank accounts of the motel's owners. Between September 2024 and January 2026, he deposited $64,581 in proceeds he knew came from the gang's sex trafficking of children and adults, and he faces an additional charge of structuring, breaking cash deposits into smaller amounts across accounts opened specifically for the purpose, staying beneath the threshold that triggers federal reporting requirements. Structuring is never accidental. It requires knowing where the reporting threshold sits and organizing your banking to stay underneath it. And the IRS special agent in charge described the conduct as concealing illicit cash, manipulating business records, and spreading deposits across multiple accounts to disguise where the income came from. Note when those deposits allegedly began. September 2024. The same month, officials stood at a podium and announced they were cleaning up the corridor. The Stadium Inn is also the motel where a 14-year-old girl was allegedly trafficked for 3 consecutive days in April 2024. What the second indictment describes then is a gang and a business operating in concert, one supplying victims while the other supplied rooms and banked the return. The corridor functioned because a legitimate commercial property was allegedly running as its infrastructure and laundering the proceeds through a bank. The conduct laid out in the superseding indictment is severe, and it remains untested. Cameron Lockett allegedly beat a victim in November 2024, striking her across the back and ribs, biting off part of her cheek, then handing her a Percocet, sending her to a hospital for stitches, and pressuring her to lie to police about how she had been hurt. That sequence contains the entire logic of the control system in miniature. Violence, then a narcotic, then medical treatment, then witness tampering, with every step protecting the operation. The drug manages the pain while reinforcing the dependency. The hospital prevents a death that would bring investigators. The false statement keeps the corridor running. Khalid Mouton allegedly trafficked 3 minors aged 14, 16, and 17, obtaining a fraudulent identification card for at least one of them so she could rent hotel rooms in her own name, and in July 2025, directing a minor victim to obtain an abortion and return to commercial sex work the same day. July 2025 falls 1 month before the first takedown. Jorge Melendez faces charges of sex trafficking a 14-year-old through force, including an incident in January 2024, where he allegedly punched her in the face at least 5 times while wearing a heavy watch and dragged her by the hair as punishment for not earning enough. LaGraine Lennox stands accused of trafficking a minor on the Figueroa corridor and in Phoenix, and of producing child sexual abuse material involving that victim in June 2024. 3 more men were charged in standalone cases as part of the same sweep. Kenny Ray Mann, 38, of Linwood; Kylan Young, 23, of Buena Park; and Dejon McDonald Williams, 23, of South Los Angeles. Each accused of trafficking minors, none of them tied to the Hoover enterprise, which indicates the trade around the corridor extends well past the organization at the center of this prosecution. McDonnell acknowledged as much directly, saying the department was monitoring other known sex work hubs across the city in anticipation that traffickers pushed off Figueroa would simply relocate. As of July 2026, this is the position. Amaya Armstead has spent 11 months in federal custody, has pleaded not guilty to every count, and has offered no public statement, no interview, and no version of events. Her trial, alongside the 10 other original defendants, is set for March 18, 2027. She has not been convicted of anything. That has to be said plainly because a case this size manufactures enormous public certainty long before any evidence has been tested. A 65-count indictment is a set of accusations written by one side, and the 51 victims listed inside it remain, at this stage, allegations attached to numbered identifiers in a court filing. Everything in this story, the tattoos, the Stadium Inn, the 14-year-old, the 90%, the $64,000, exists because prosecutors put it in a document. None of it has yet faced a defense attorney in front of a jury, and some of it will not survive that process. That is what trials are for. Conviction carries a mandatory minimum of 15 years in federal prison for some defendants and a statutory maximum of life. Those numbers are not abstractions on this corridor. The pimp whose case opened the September 2024 press conference, the one who expected $1,000 a night from a 15-year-old, is already serving life in federal prison after a 5-day trial. For a 26-year-old woman, a 15-year mandatory minimum means walking out somewhere in her 40s, while the maximum means she never walks out at all. There is something worth sitting with at the end of this. The story traveled because of a woman, a 25-year-old identified by the Justice Department as the de facto leader of a Hoover set, accused of trafficking a girl of 14. That configuration is unusual enough to move quickly, and it has moved very widely. It is why her name sits in the title of this video. The corridor is the part that never travels. Federal prosecutors have now charged 18 people across 2 indictments, identified 51 victims, charged a motel manager, and traced the money into a bank account. They have brought Homeland Security investigations, the IRS, the FBI, and the LAPD to bear on 3.5 miles of a single street, announced an initiative with the mayor standing beside them, and already secured a life sentence on that same pavement. And the enterprise kept running through all of it. 21 months past the press conference, 10 months past the first wave of arrests, which suggests something uncomfortable about how much of it ever depended on any one person at the top. Remove a leader, and the structure absorbs the loss. This is an organization that has survived being renamed twice, losing every outside alliance it ever held, 6 decades of feuds with Bloods, Crips, and everyone in between, the crack era, and every task force assembled against it since the 1960s. It was operating on those blocks before the Crips existed. It has outlasted every previous attempt to end it. Demand holds steady. The rooms are still standing. The supply of 14-year-olds with nobody looking for them was never produced by a gang and will not be eliminated by an indictment, because foster care keeps discharging young people with nowhere to go and children keep leaving homes they cannot survive in. The Blade was the Blade long before anyone named in either of these indictments was born. Whatever a jury decides about Amaya Armstead in March 2027, this much is already settled. It took a 5-year federal investigation, 2 grand juries, more than a dozen law enforcement agencies, and 65 criminal counts to reach a stretch of Los Angeles street that had been operating in daylight in plain view for decades, and the 51 people named in that filing were there the entire time.